All right, go, Brian.
Very nice.
Thank you.
I had a question. I don't know if I missed your telling us this, but is the score Gurecki's music?
Wait, 1 second. I'm having a little difficulty right
Okay.
here. All right, perfect. Now I can see everyone. Yeah, the score is by Tamika Reed and Alexander Hawkins, and it was like this album
Okay.
created last year called Shards and Constellations. So that
Okay.
was what I was listening to and used for the project.
You, at some point, you might want to look at Gurecki's scores, because he writes his scores like you're drawing, and his music has actually probably influenced the composers you're looking at. He did one piece, which is the same amount of time it took for the bomb in Hiroshima to drop, and it's only string instruments. It's like 47 string instruments screaming. But it's a drawing that he did, which is played. And it's really so right on relevant for what you're doing.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Brian.
Hello.
That's your name. Okay, great. Yeah, what a beautiful film. You know, I love your definition of consciousness. I'm not sure if it's a borrowed definition or a completely original one of your own making, but I think it's very beautiful and appropriate to what you've done. What I find so effective and powerful about this medium of the film is that you're really able to reinforce the dimension of time in your project. And I just loved when you began with these shards appearing on the musical the musical lines, and then the transition into the color and shadow on the ground, I think was really beautiful. And, you know, what's so exciting about watching the film is just watching these transitions from different states of reality. You know, so you go through models, you go through photographs, and I love at the very end when you get to the watercolor drawings, and there's also some very beautiful kind of mysterious color interior film work. It's like the interiors of spaces.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just wonderful. You know, what I'm thinking of when I'm looking at your 30 some odd slides here is that the project is really in between all of these different modes that you've invented here, right? So I love it because the project, you know, it's not only proposing an object, but it's also proposing new ways of hearing sound, experiencing light, experiencing color. And it's very beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's a great project, and I think the shards and constellations music could better inform the interior. In other words, if you had another 3 weeks to work on this, you could really get inside of it, because I think where it came in model form on slide 22, 23, 24 is way, you know, and 25 and 26 is way more promising than what you had a chance to do on the interior. I think that the interior could be, you know, somehow could be really explored and stay along with that music, and that music becomes a kind of frame, and the whole project becomes an experiment in making architecture according to a situation in music.
Brian, are you the person whose bathroom flooded?
No, that was Alex.
Oh, okay.
My bathroom's fine.
Okay, so you were able to focus. Okay.
Yeah.
Listen, waiting in on the first project after people have been intensely together for a period of time as a guest is exactly what we're supposed to do, but you can feel very presumptuous thinking you understood it in a few moments. But what Stephen brought up about the interior, I tend to agree with. It's just to start with something that it's an incredible project. What I got wondering about from the moment you began to when it was over was if you kept working, how much of the planarity would remain? Would the planes themselves start to get dissolved by the ideas in your work? But I don't mean to indicate that as something that's lacking. It's actually, I think, an extraordinary project, but that's where I would go. It's also, I would just even wonder, is there some conceptual relationship between the use of the plane, even when it's a plane that's been effectively become a shard, therefore kind of broken, I guess. Is the plane just, does it have some sort of history that you could play with or go back in? But to be simple about it, would it break apart more? But I have something more, having been around Stephen's studios for so many years, and Irini and Dimitra, and this film aspect of it here is really a wonderful process. I have a really simple thing to say. Stephen knows a music theorist at Yale. He's a good friend of mine, also Brian Kane. And Brian used to come and lecture, I know, for Stephen and for me in classes. And I would particularly ask him to talk about time and music, you know, obviously a huge subject. I would ask him about, there are aspects of time that appear to flow backwards in music. And in particular, I gave him a few examples where I thought that was true. And then he said, yeah, you're not wrong about that, Michael, let me explain. But the reason I bring it up here is, as you were transcribing the score in the film, the music was playing and then you were leaving evidence in the drawing. So time was flowing. Part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4 kind of went backwards in time. And as it flows in time, you were then transcribing it. It was becoming volumetric. You were starting to make three-dimensional space, quasi-architectural. So the whole thing left me feeling that the kind of atonality of the music, the kind of sort of chaotic anxiety of the music, there's a kind of escape quality going on. I feel like the composers are trying to escape time. And then there's the building, which is a sort of aftermath of your experience with the music. So I think that there's something really powerful happening in the whole way you're working. I'm sure it's going to be true for everybody today. So you're in time, time is being transcribed into space. Therefore, now you have volume. And now the volume exists without the music. And in a way stays in perpetuity. Cut the music off and the architecture stays. So it's extraordinary. It's very, I must say the whole thing's like feels very emotional and kind of tense, violent, but with a kind of tapping sound. I don't know, there's so many qualities that you were capturing. I want to say something very superficial. If I was on your team, let's say you and I were doing this together, I would have naively said, "Hey, Brian, are we okay with this kind of Russian constructivism red?" And I would have naively asked, like, "Do we need different colors?"
But Michael, couldn't that be
Oh.
Bernard Tschumi red?
Yeah, Stephen, since I'm supposed to be a guest critic, I'm supposed to say something more serious than that. But the positive statement would be, like, does the red kind of help you cut through space in some way? Like, there's probably a good reason for the red.
The red shadows. I think it was
Yeah.
it was my fault as a critic, because when he first started this, he showed some constructions from before, and there was red glass.
Yeah.
And then they threw these mysterious red shadows, and I felt that somehow that was the quality of a red shadow, I thought. And then that's something that I think could go further, not to take it out. I wonder about the adding of that green and the whole interior, not really taking let's say the full idea of this red shadows, And then I love these two drawings that are on the screen right now, because the time, when the sun moves across the site, you're going to get in the late afternoon, the one on the right, and you really actually get those red shadows out on the courtyard. I think that's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, Stephen, I'm really wading in, so I see what you're bringing up. The question, I don't have an answer for this, but in the music, I kept hearing, with the percussion and the kind of slapping of things, I also kept hearing the plucking of strings.
Right.
And then I was feeling like that, they weren't just strings, they were violin strings, therefore they're woven and they're multiple strings. But all of it was making me also, Stephen, remember Brian Kane talking about touch and timbre in music. Two musicians play the exact same score, but the way they touch everything is different, therefore it's different. So I wonder if the kind of like the hard geometry, meaning it's linear, and that the shadows and the tonality of color, et cetera, could start to bring forth some of the suppleness of what's in an actual instrument. I mean, to be really naive about it, I wondered if part of your building could even be woven. Now that
Right.
sounds out of the blue, but some of the instruments have hard surfaces, sometimes there's soft surfaces. Could light hit something and be sucked into it? Could light hit something else and be utterly unable to penetrate? But I mean, this Stephen and Irene, the really amazing thing here, though, is the La Jetée comparison, and not making the film so much for presentation, so much as I feel like the film is part of how you experience the music, is thereby how you composed architecture.
Well,
you were in time, yeah.
We all have a language, no matter if we're a physicist, it might be mathematics. If you're a dancer, it might be a language of movement. Architects use drawing, and there's a spatial tectonic language that we try to put into our drawing or a model building. But I think, I'm working on a performance hall music school, and suddenly the lines that I see have other attributes that I never thought of before, because they're reflecting sounds. Some are dead spots, some are absorbing sounds, some are reflecting sounds, some are isolating sounds. So it's a different, the marks mean something differently when I'm thinking about sound. And I know that you can make optics completely a graphic exercise, right? When light hits a curved surface, it refracts. So there's a way of seeing form in terms of architecture and things. There's a way of seeing form and geometry in terms of its performance with sound. And there's a way of seeing those same lines in terms of music. And that's why I encourage you, it's actually not Gorecki, it's Penderecki. It's the most extraordinary score that looks a lot like yours, your marks, your drawing. And it's just to make this crossover from the language of architecture that should include sound and light, but we don't see those marks as the language of sound and light. We see them as the language of form. Is the potential of your project. Of course, it's a much bigger project than the short sketch project that you've had, but it is the potential of it. And it is a way of activating the language so it goes beyond solid and void when you make a mark. So I encourage you to look at this score that I sent you the link for. It's an animated score. It has to be, I mean, it's just extraordinary. And there's shards in there. And he's using it to represent sound, which I think you want to bring the sound and light into your language as well.
When your project reminds me of the way how Kandinsky actually taught at Bauhaus at the first year of the student. And now you engage, you have to look at it. It's a pretty amazing the way how he using this the line, which is really the connection between the object. It has to show the tension. I think that tension, you using your score as well as the music, is really kind of remind me the whole drawing of the Kandinsky. So the first, yes, that the shadow and star is actually, yeah. I mean, those things, and also the first score of your black in animation.
Yeah.
So I think come back, it's a kind of reverse process of the way how Kandinsky worked. And I think when I see your model with a color, and I think the line might be really not really present in your project, but I think the way how the color vibrating each other. So let's just say, I don't know, it's supposed to be color of the red or it's supposed to be yellow, that I don't know. But I think the way how they vibrate, you see the yellow, all of a sudden you see the red, constantly vibrating. That might be the kind of a continuous line that will show as a sort of tension, will be kind of reverse of the Kandinsky reading of the drawing. So I think it's really, really beautiful. So I think when you see the last, your model, to see the color choice, I think we'll think about something, how this, the color actually constantly moving back and forth. That will be for me, the next sort of move.
Thank you.
Brian, I'm just adding a footnote here because a lot, if not everything, has been said already. I do want to take where Professor Xiong left it, which I thought was a very extraordinary comment, particularly when you start to think about how to actually make what you're proposing. Making in terms of like the construction methodologies, materialities, and so on and so forth, which probably would come in like a later iteration. That's where I also think Stephen's comment in terms of like why red, or as Michael also pointed out, and like what kind of red, and like is it a red that comes from glass, or is it a red that comes from, in fact, like the density of your shadows, could be like a next point of departure. What I'm so interested in here also is like, how do you, and maybe this is a little bit like a suggestion for you in terms of how your next 3 weeks could look like, assuming you're going to do something with the project, which is a whole different story for a different time. But like, I would start to look at the site, and I would start to look at you know, the term figure ground, right? Like I would really start to look like, how does your figure, how does it start to touch the ground, and what does it actually do with it? And I would think not just in terms of landscapes, but also in terms of like what tectonics do your landscapes take on. This is not so uninteresting when you then go back and forth to also a point Stephen made in regards to what does your interior look like, right? You can't do the exterior without the interior, and the landscape, or the kind of the site that you're on, or like how you position a project, is part of an interior, right? That may be kind of an urban interior, it may be a rural interior, but it's part of like a space that you inhabit all by itself. That's why also I liked some of the things that you didn't speak about, but you also didn't have to, because one saw it in your film, like the body of water, reflection, the density of shade, the linearity of the planar. All of that makes your film so important. going now again, like forward into what you're gonna do with it, I think I would completely forget not forget, I mean, you obviously have it there right in front of you, but we just like start to look at its components, right? Like, how do those volumes meet? What do those details look like? How does it meet the ground? Does it maybe lift off, like, and so on and so forth? But too early for that. But you know, 3 weeks, my goodness, this is like a whole semester of
Yeah, it's amazing work. Amazing. Let's move to another one. He's too good. You know, we can't give him so many words. He's too good for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. We will continue with Alexander.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Alex.
I'll start with the video. I'll share again for the presentation. Juggling Hudson, a vessel for education. The discovery of the apple was a coincidence. I began my exploration of the brief with an interest in light and color as exhibited by the Hudson Valley School of Painting, which led to a series of color boxes of reflected light. I developed a language of frame construction with colored panels, polychrome livable walls arranged around a central courtyard. What interested me was bringing the colors of the Hudson Valley into the architecture with layers of diaphanous filters and precise openings, framing and abstracting the pavilion's surroundings. Towards the end of the residency, when asked how exactly to organize or orient these walls, the question came up, how can the structure be caught in light? To catch light like one catches an apple. This vessel for an apple triggered an avalanche of poetic possibilities. Catch sounds like biting into a crisp apple, and 89% of New York State's fruit tree acreage is made up of apple trees, many of which are located along the fertile Hudson Valley. This structure then is not a literal translation of a vessel for an apple, but rather the analogous architecture of juggling light and color throughout the days and weeks of a year. Punctures are oriented towards specific times and days, orienting the visitors towards the cosmic and universal specificity of this place. Transformation of consciousness happens through the poetic coincidence of the Hudson Valley's flora and the architecture that arises from it. The apple announces its presence before impact, a color caught in a receiving hand. Thank you.
But Alex, can you please show the couple of things that you were where you were before? I mean, this is a whole new project that you did over the last 4 days. And I just wonder if we could just have a couple of images of where you were last
Alex,
week.
did you mean to share the text or visuals as you were reading the text?
Oh, the visuals. Wow,
'Cause,
I'm so
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, there were no visuals.
Jesus Christ. Of course. I'm so sorry. Of course, this happens at the final
Oh, yeah.
presentation.
Okay, good.
Oh, God. Classic.
Do you
So
want
just
to
go
flip
backwards.
through
Just
it?
go
Yes.
backwards. Go backwards because we're going in chronological reverse. I mean,
Right. Huh. Yeah, so here. I wish, should I redo it? Should I just read the script?
no.
again?
Let's just look
No?
at the images. I mean,
Yeah,
they speak for themselves, you know.
yeah. That's what happens when you have two screens. I shared the wrong screens. I'm very sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
So here, this, on the left, you see the north-south section where the bigger openings are in the winter months, the small openings in the summer months, and this vessel really being partly underground. Here, the side plan of the actual vessel, and let's say the poetic vehicle for this project, which was this vessel for an apple, and then cutting through the apple, slicing the apple, finding the color also reflected onto the interior, finding the seed, the apple seed.
Aha. So you
and then,
still have the reflected color there in a different way. I see what you're saying. Huh?
Yeah. Here, that kind of analogy between throwing the apple and the arc of the sun. And then here, the previous studies. Oh God, I really wish I'd told this presentation with the images before. But here are the kind of frame diaphanous studies, the interior color courtyard, these colored walls.
Yeah, I really liked. I have to say, I really liked this project at that point. But what I really enjoy is your will to kind of just make a whole new project in 3 days. This right here, it was my favorite moment. That curved wall where the color was reflecting inside that wall, and that's kind of where we the last time we saw you, we were here, and you made in the last 3 days or 4 days, you made an entirely new project, which is amazing.
Are you proposing that this color be brought in to this final project as well?
Yeah, so it's really, I mean, the color, I thought, well, should it be the sky? Should it be the trees around it that filter through this diaphanous wall? And so the color could come back. But really the juggling of light, the juggling of color through these precise openings for specific days of the year is what kind of drove this exploration over the last couple of days. And then this vessel to catch the sunlight and the color.
So none of those openings, they're all for the sun. They're not for viewing out into the landscape.
No, they all they bring sunlight in at the specific angle at which
Right.
they're cut, and then look out into the sky.
But they potentially could be aligned with another opening on the other side of the vessel and on the exterior wall to frame the colors that are existing, so that the color that could be brought into the diaphanous walls could also correspond with coincidence of different times of year. You know, given the fact that there's autumn and there's apples and there's a range of colors that you're observing, that these openings can be used the way you have them for the moments of the sun across the time, but there also could be alignments of openings that frame views. And also the actual applied color could be brought into these diaphanous walls as well.
It seems to me more of an introvert project, that all the cuts look inside, like
directly maybe the analogy of the seed, of the apple seed itself. I love the poetic dimension of it. And Alexander, it came through, your presentation came through beautifully, even though you didn't perfectly align it the way you want it with the images, but it came through 100%. I love the presentation. I love the analogy with the apple, the sunrise, the way you brought it back to New York. It all connects beautifully. I wonder if, and with the orchards on the site, as a matter of fact, that they have on Montgomery Place. And I think that maybe in terms of consciousness, it all be introvert. Maybe as you have proposed here, the views are only looking across that peripheral circle link path that you take, and therefore kind of connect deeper into one's consciousness. I'm not sure, but I love your project. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, Alexander, it was really, I really appreciate the comments, and I would agree. Your words were so clear. I was, the images that you showed after really kind of reaffirmed what you said. So it was actually maybe nice that you had the little disjunction, because it was also really beautiful to see the latter part of the first project in relation to the cone of light. And I'll just try and be very succinct, but I think there's something very beautiful in the schism that you're facing between the first version of your project and the current version of your project. And I think it goes to the heart of your question of color and consciousness, which is, where does color reside? Is color something that happens internally within all of us? In other words, something that's processed within our cognitive makeup, or is it something outside of us in the world? And the most sophisticated scientists still don't have a definitive answer as to where it is, right? And I love the problem that your project poses, right? Because does the color and light come from outside, or is it somewhat embedded within? And, of course, I'm going to give the easiest suggestion, which is to embrace both, right? And because there's no reason why you shouldn't or couldn't, right? So there may be moments within your project where you mark it with these beautiful episodes of color from space to space. And then there may be other moments where you have this diaphragm, as you call it, I think, where it's potentially this very beautiful skin of luminosity that can bring in light and bring in color. So I think it's really wonderful. And I love the way you've constructed the models and have gone into them with the photographic eye, because I think it really puts us in the heart of the space. And it's a very precise and beautifully provocative and evocative project.
Thank you.
And Alex, congratulations. It seems like you took Stephen's comments from last week quite seriously and didn't want to do the Swiss box, right? I wanted to do the opposite of the Swiss box. I think you've made a very beautiful project. And in such a short time, of course, it's very suggestive in probably its development, right, at this point, and how you might start to develop it. One thing that I too love the idea that the apple is this kind of receiver that starts to kind of help you find the form of the shape and then start to exploit the characteristics of light within it. I am a little confused, and I think it's probably because of the rapid nature of where you are right now, is how do you experience it, right? And right now it seems like it's a series of levels as opposed to maybe a continuous spiral, right? And I was wondering about the role of light when bringing in such strong natural light that's going to be affected only from above and from, let's say, sky. I suspect what one would want to study in a project like this is when does that strong light actually start to be affected by the landscape colors that are around it, and can it? I mean, I think it's kind of a discovery that you need to kind of explore, right? And I think these first two projects are about projects that literally become the project, right? The project for later development. Because I think when you're above ground versus below ground, right? And how can, through that through that layer of that enclosure, start to bring those, because of a strong clear light, can it in fact actually, through a contemplative space, actually start to change your perception of that clear light, and it starts to gradually change color, right? Just by the occupying and being in a contemplative space and letting the mind start to transform that clear color into, right, that kind of natural white color into color. You know, and I think back at some of the early James Turrell pieces, right, where you have to kind of sit in the space for a while before one starts to experience or find the color, right, and how the mind has to kind of work to find color. So I think you're on the way to an interesting investigation, right, in the role of how color can be affected. And I'm very curious about kind of going down to the bottom and maybe, and then occupying underneath this. Right now, the kind of section cut is so pinched at the very bottom. And I wondered, don't you want to occupy that condition, right? Or what happens in that kind of very special condition of that tension? But nice project.
Thank you. I was imagining that you would lay on your back underneath this massive vessel, and then you could look through an opening up. That's why I put it down only 4 feet above the ground.
Can I ask you a question? That opening sentence about the apple announces its presence. Does, on my screen during your presentation, I had a video of you, not the film, and I was hunting all over for the architecture. Does that literally mean that the light is showing up on the hand before the form or volume or weight of the apple? That's what you mean, correct?
In the video?
Well, no, just in the sentence. The apple announces its presence before impact. So it's the light is hitting the hand before the form.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. No, it's over years of teaching and just being human. Sometimes it's you learn it's best to go back to the first thing someone said and see if you were right about it. You know, first, it's a remarkable project and remarkable set of ideas. Years ago, several years ago, I ran 2 studios dealing with Frank Stella's book and essays, Working Space. Gave 6 lectures at Harvard back in the early 80s, where he led himself through the Renaissance or before Dutch realism. But Stella was sort of describing that he felt as if he and others were describing that abstraction was at a dead end. Painting needed to recover something. He wondered if there was a future for abstraction, but he had these kind of, serious questions. He's, a wildly intelligent person, but he's also a practitioner, and he hovers between practice and thinking. This is Stella. But I actually contacted his assistant, and he ended up engaging both studios pretty heavily and looking at work and giving comments and all of this. But the reason I bring it up was that the students were like blown away by having a chance to talk to him. Later, we did something that evolved from that. We started dealing with light, and this is something that I wonder what you might do. We took these kind of things that were poetic and theoretical and tried to measure them a bit. So in other words, when that light is hitting the hand, what's the speed of light versus the form falling in gravity? How many kind of qualities could you empirically pull out of that? The apple's falling due to gravity. Light from the apple is moving at a different speed. And then I love your project, but I feel like you're on the verge of just some massively complex and interesting thinking. 2 humans get close to each other. I was going to put up a picture of Lucille Ball, one of those super corrected Lucille Ball, heavily made up and then virtually repainted in the 1940s. But the degree to which the shape of the human face, whether it's from a Renaissance painting up into a early 20th century Hollywood character, the topology of a face, the geometry of a face, light, and an attempt to see and measure that. So, Lucille Ball,
Michael, if you go back to the Renaissance, I like what you're saying. If you go back to the Renaissance, you might find a painting of the tree of knowledge and Adam and Eve eating the apple, the forbidden fruit. So then you get all the way back to, sort of philosophical roots. And when I saw that apple in the film, I thought, who's doing this project? I mean, that can't be Alex's project. He didn't have any of those ideas last 3 days ago, right? And I think, it's amazing. I think he's really using this studio to try, to try a lot of different ideas. That's why I like this. And I think that this, this connection of the apple, that could be a very deep philosophical connection. It isn't just the fact that the Hudson Valley has all those apple trees. You could find a much more poetic depth to the narrative. I don't know. I mean, that's what I must say. I was mesmerized by the beginning of the video, because the last time I saw him, he was doing something like Barragan, with colored walls and two parallel walls. In fact, it was a long building. But then this apple starts, in a way, he also, I think, learned from La Jetée, right? Where you say things without saying them.
There's a lot more here. I think there's a lot more here than you realize, Alex. And I mean, the diaphanous wall acts as a reflector. There is a painter who makes paintings just by using translucent tubes to reflect light. So they actually will reflect light of the surroundings as you intend. But also, in terms of what you just brought up, Stephen, there's Darwin's apple, and actually the descendant tree from Darwin's tree is here in Providence. It's on Brown University's campus, so you can actually see the actual little descendant of Darwin's tree. So that's what I thought of when I thought of this moment of consciousness, of seeing gravity act upon the tree, upon the apple. But I think those things are actually even more significant than the overt moments of time. And perhaps they, like there's impact, and you say color caught and before impact, there's what is catching the color? Is it the walls that are catching the color? Is it the viewer that, is standing within the frame of something that's beyond? Or is it?
And we don't want to answer that, right, Kina? In other words, poem, Alex, a poem never really answers it. It leaves it open to be interpreted. And that's the essence of poetry, that it has this beautiful suggestive power. And I think that's a lot in here. So
the apple also, you showed, it's like I remember the Stephen's project, Bunker Center, that I think it was Michael or Stephen, you explained that the Bunker Center is like almost glacier was filled solid under the building, and that become meltdown.
Right.
So I think it reminds me, this apple, yes, it's a solid, and you show one point that it starts to changing the color. So it is a live things that actually affecting by this light as well as the air, that it eating up and change the color and become completely void right now in your building. So I think that's an incredibly poetic in that sense. It's not about the solid become void, but it become completely disappear through this environment. And I think that's incredibly beautiful.
I was going to say, in terms of being, in the process of working, if Stephen would know this, I'm sure a lot of people, the New York Times building, Renzo Piano building worktop, the daylighting was done by Lawrence Berkeley Labs, not by conventional architectural engineers. And, a lot of those people who worked on that later became professors of architecture, because architects kind of valued what they did. But the reason I bring it up was today you get a plug-in for Rhino called Diva, which you probably know about. And there's a million kind of off-the-shelf ways to measure light. When they were doing New York Times with Lawrence Berkeley Labs, they were writing software to do it. But I bring all that up to say that before you get to the shape of the apple and the shape of the vessel and the cylindrical form, all of which I can see how you got there, I think you could back up now and think more about different entities approaching each other and what is received first. Because when La Jetée is still images. Stanford Quinter, Bruce Mal put La Jetée into a book form years ago. They got Chris Marker to show him and give the real images so they could do that. There is one piece of motion in La Jetée, which I'm sure you noticed. It doesn't the young woman open her eyes or a slight.
Yeah, she blinks.
She blinks. And suddenly there's a liquid quality to what otherwise is still But when I thought of your project in that regard, I just thought of how many things, like just two people approaching each other and the light from one reflecting on another, and how far you could go. I also, we all have random thoughts that come because of what we happen to notice or read. I was thinking of Faulkner, Light in August, the novel. The character Lena, she's riding, in the book opens with a character Lena walking down a dirt road in rural Mississippi. She sees a wagon in the distance. She talks about seeing it before she can hear it. It becomes a whole process of kind of imagining space and time. That the ability to imagine space and time alters the kind of predicament and crisis that she's in. She can basically see time. All to say that the vessel might be really premature as a form. It carried your project, but it seems to me you're onto something much bigger. And even if you look at the history of photography, from going from paintings and chiaroscuro and sfumata up to photography, and then into something like strobe photography. Is it Eggleston, I think is the name? Different ways in which photography becomes technical so that it can alter the lens's ability to capture motion. And then finally down to, obviously something like a microscope, where now you're dealing with molecular aspects of light and apprehension. Stephen, as I look at this cored out apple, just wondering how, what's the chemistry and biology of an apple going from translucent to red like that? How the hell does that happen? In other words, like, people talk about growing buildings a lot these days, if you meditated on that here, and light penetrating the soil to light penetrating the seed, growing, anyway, I'll stop there. I thought your opening sentence here, it's huge. We did a studio, we're working with designing a design studio for Tesla in Los Angeles, and everybody's—
Michael, you said you were going to stop there.
Well, I was going to say a very technical thing comes up. It's like you need 7,000 lumens of light to look at a clay model of a car. Oh. And then you need to dramatically lower the light and have the LED light come off a HP workstation and into your eye. So just the degree to which something light like this could be poetic and about Adam and Eve and everything else, it also literally happens all day long in our work. You look like you have a window behind you that's hitting a physical model you made of this. But literally all of us work with light coming off of screens now. Most of us used to work with light bouncing off a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. So the reason I'm going down this kind of rabbit hole is this thing could be, philosophically and driven through physics, or it could also be highly pragmatic. Two people saying hello while they wait for the subway, and the light bouncing off one and the other. Mm-hmm. It's hugely open when you write it this way.
I know we are out of time, Erie. I just have one comment, like maybe as a follow-up to what Michael was saying, which I think is quite profound. It may not be about the apple. And like, I also wanted to point out the model to your right, I guess, which I find quite extraordinary, the one that's behind you, which in your future presentations you should utilize, which is also a compliment for your presentation, which I think it was very good that your reading and the slides were kind of separate. What I did want to say though is, I'm confused about the apple. I love the idea, I love the film, I love your sections, I love your mods, I love the color. And I also do like apples. I just think it takes a bit too much of a presence that may not be there, but this is for you to decide. But there's one thing, Alexandra, that I would like you to take with you for the next 3 weeks, which is something I'm reading right now by Jordan Allenberg, which is called Shape. And it speaks about the hidden geometry of information, biology, and strategy. And there's a lot of things, particularly, I think from the 4th chapter on, that I think you would find either useful or inspirational. You're gonna make up your own mind. Where at a certain point, the apple doesn't need to go away, but it may just take on a different kind of importance. Also in terms of scale, right? It's a bit too literal at the moment, in kind of something that you hold in your hands and then the building holds you in your hands. But
yes, that's a great idea. Do you know what a guffaw is, Christoph?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a famous film called The Maltese Falcon, and
Oh.
it's from 1934. You've got to watch it, Alex. You got to look at this film, The Maltese Falcon. So in the beginning of the film, there's this steel a statue of a Maltese falcon. Becomes a big obsessive thing about the film, but somewhere in the film it disappears, and at the end of the film it's not there anymore.
Yeah.
But the film is called The Maltese Falcon, and that's one of the most mysterious, So I love what Christoph is saying, that that apple might go away. Maybe that's the whole problem here. Anyway,
We saw
I
that.
think we have to go to the next.
We saw the
Yes.
falcon in San Francisco, no?
Yes, yeah, it's at Joe's on Market Street.
Second floor.
It's the actual bronze statue of that Maltese falcon actually exists in a very old restaurant on the second floor, famous old restaurant that Humphrey Bogart and all those people used to go to. Anyway, Alex, watch the Maltese Falcon, and it's very interesting. Christoph is coming up with a very interesting idea about your project.
Christoph, and to whoever is typing notes or references into the chat, please make sure to choose all panelists and attendees so that our audience can also receive those comments. You can see that in the chat, you have the option to address the audience as well. Christoph, you may want to put that book in the chat as well. All right, Yolan, you're ready?
Yes, okay, I'll share my screen and I'll play the video first and then switch to the PDF slide.
Okay.
All right, again. All right, and then I'll share it to my presentation. Right, so I'm Yolanda, and the title for my project is The Stream of Fragments. Based on the main theme of Summer's residency program, the transformation of consciousness, I started by revising the intricate nature of human consciousness. For me, consciousness is the unitary moment that takes shape in an ongoing stream of experience. However, a contrast is posed between such uninterrupted occurrence and the reality We are in a world that everything is in parts and fragments. From this paradox observed, I intended to shed light on a beautiful incongruity that exists between our minds and the reality by creating a space in which people may perceive a distinction between the two different kinds of spaces, positive spaces in parts and negative spaces in continuity. The volume of the project plays with events happening above and below the ground, with an undulating circulation in space. It is a building that flows in odd directions of the axis, encouraging people to seek a balance in between. I started with a series of sketches on still. These ones started to trying to visualize the idea of the contrast between two kind of volumes. So we can see the volumes above the ground, they are separated, and then there is this bigger continuous volume that's under the ground, which connects them together. And then I started with this drawing here to play with the undulations of the curves and then also the geometries by pushing them up or down on a paper. I made my first sketch model, which plays with the light and also the fragmented parts above the surface of the paper, then also with the volume that underlies beneath and in this space here, connecting everything above. And then the light also indicates the positions of the geometries above the ground while people are standing down in the volume. So there's this, my second sketch model, which I took more consideration of scale and programs of the project. And then again, I made more details based on the geometries of the building, and then shed light again in the underground to see this contrast between the two realms. Following this, I started to create internal or like bigger models to actually put my cameras inside to create these interiors for the project, and exploring how light can come into this building to play a role with directing the volumes and the flowing of space. This is a site plan, so the building is oriented accordingly with these two main streets, roads on the site. And then we can also see how people can enter here from this ramp also, or from this more or less like less important smaller ramp here, entering into the auditorium space with the roof above that people can walk up to. It is more clear in this render view, which we can see the undulations or the ups or down of the overall volume of the project.
Yolanda, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Could you go back to that image just before? This is so spectacular. I wonder why you didn't include that in your video. I think, this really has this architectonic truth to it, where the video is so beautiful, but it's all just these perfect digital renderings. I mean, I think you really need, you need to, in order to make that video honestly about your project, you've got to put in a few of these things somewhere in it. So,
Right. Got it. Okay.
Yeah. This is great.
Thank you. And the ground plan, which more it's like indicating the programs inside of the interior. So down the ramp, we can see this gathering space created, and then the audience space for the visitors. And then to the left, we have the carved out area of the cafe. And up the stairs, we have this bigger classroom that can hold the visitors or lectures. And then below, we have the office space. And this is the first section, cutting through the ramp, and also from the left, we can see this bigger classroom here with the cafe underneath, and then on the right is the gathering space for the lecturers and visitors. In this plan is the other orientation. It's more clearly showing the gathering space and also the walkable roofs on the left with the ramp entering the project. This is an illustration for the entrance point. We can see how the project has this dialogue with the landscape. So it's not just sitting on the ground, but it's kind of sitting in between, creating a dialogue in between. And then this illustration is showing the view from the classroom, looking down to the cafe, also the ramp, and seeing some of the landscape above, also with the undulation of the roof. An elevation for general illustration, looking at the surroundings. And then this here, we are seeing the walkable roof again with the landscape surrounding this whole project and just carve out space for the gathering space.
Yolanda, can you open up all the visuals so we can start the conversation?
Yes, again, this is the last slide, which is showing the exterior view looking from the sidewalk in.
Beautiful.
Yeah, this is the overall PDF for the project. Thank you.
Yolanda, the interior spaces are quite beautiful, especially in slide 24. But there's something really remarkable about slide 23 that I wish I could see more of. And I think there's another one closer to slide 26, which is because of the framework that you've defined for yourself as far as how building is sort of relating to memory as positive and negative. It sort of suggests that there's these figures in the field that are the positive, and the landscape is kind of weaving between them. It becomes the building. And so this is a really beautiful image where I think we start to sense that connection about how the landscape is coming in or how the building is extending out. I see a little bit less of that on the following image, but then if you keep going to there, like I think an image like this is starting to connect that surface, which is building back to the landscape, and there's a moment of tension just as that surface touches the ground. But I think, you know, if you were refining this a little bit further, I think I'd love to see how the two are more. There's a more of a seamless connection between the two, right? So that it's more of a continuous negative flow between these positive elements as you described.
I agree. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's definitely a highly developed planar language that comes directly from that relief cut process of the paper model, and you've taken it, you know, completely all the way to literalness into the point where it almost feels like it's built. So I guess it's also would be concrete. I mean, how you're going to get those thin planes? I imagine it has to be concrete.
Yep.
And, I mean,
actually,
yeah, go ahead.
I had this structure built in the Rhino model, but I did not show it in this PDF because I thought that was like getting too far into the detail of the construction site. But yeah, for sure, like the structure would be concrete as a base, and then
do you have an office that you had work on this? I mean, this is like a project that took 6 months, no?
No, I don't have the office behind me.
It's amazing.
Thank you.
It's an amazing video. I mean, I have 33 people. I can't produce a video like that. You did that, you know, over the weekend. I mean, it's amazing. You must have worked 48 hours a day or something, right?
No, I did not. It's I used Unreal Engine, which is super fast with rendering out video. So yeah, I recommend everyone to try that out.
What's it called?
Unreal Engine. It's
Real
often for
Engine.
Yeah,
it's
so
often for gaming.
the modeling is done in the animation software itself, right? Yeah. It's Stephen, it's not like you do a model and then import it and
Oh, it's the opposite. You do the
it's like video gaming, yeah. It's a good question, Stephen, this time thing, because I had similar intuition that in all these projects that software is making it possible to do a lot quicker, which is an understatement, but it seems Unreal Engine is for doing video games. It's not really designed for architectural production, but people are using it that way. But I have a quick question. Is this an open, hearing the birds and the sounds? So was the pavilion, how was that sound getting inside? There's not glass? There
are glasses around the whole building. So, flaw, I guess. It's
I'm not trying to find a flaw in your logic so much as
right.
that to hear to be in the
Mhm.
construction and to also have this continuity with sounds of birds, that's an aspiration, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's you know, you're always hesitant to be personal about it, but it's not that often as a guest. It's not that often, you know, where we're all in a space where we hear nature so clearly. And in this case, birds, like in the city, it's obviously drowned out. I've been in plenty of places, especially lately, where I hear it. But you know, your project's remarkable in a lot of ways. It feels a little too architectural too soon for me, but that's a reckless statement. The reason I make it is I often think that when you're designing in the first few stages, you know, that could be a week or it could be 3 years, that there's a way that you're, even though you're working with purpose, you're really just scraping the surface of something that's appealing to you, that's far deeper, that you don't even know exists yet. So in your case, you know, I don't know anything about film per se, but I often think of method acting, and that if you start to get a feel for something that you imagine is important in architecture, instead of trying to become an elite student or a refined student with this kind of debate with your professor, and you refine it through kind of brute force thinking, that could you instead be more like Daniel Day-Lewis playing Abraham Lincoln? You effectively try to become something that you've never met. You know, we don't know what Lincoln sounds like. So when Daniel Day-Lewis plays him, he's free to invent a voice. He gave Lincoln a high-pitched voice, which kind of surprised people. So in your case, I'm wondering about just like method acting, what it is to be in architecture and to hear the world as if it had never been interrupted. Then, you know, I love your project and I can see the skill in it, but to me, that's like a hugely interesting question. Like, like what in what architecture do you not interrupt the sounds that existed? Like, we might be heading there as people stop working, automation makes us jobless. I was in Shanghai for the first time in a few years, right before COVID, and I was walking near Tongji University on a street I've been on a million times. And it dawned on me the street was pretty silent. The scooters were electric, the cars were hybrid and going slow, so they were all electric. And like this noisy street in 2 years had become silent. So anyway, that's I don't know your name, Yolanda. That to me is like that's what I was struck by. And if it's just sometimes people call something a conceit, meaning it's something you're forcing to happen, but is it real? But I think so in your building, if there's too much glass, you're not going to hear those birds that way. But maybe there would be enough glass that the bird sounds would get in and they would reverberate with the hard surfaces.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Yes.
That's what, Stephen, I was thinking of just buildings that use animals. There's a history of them, like modern buildings where animals are important.
The problem with the glass is right at dusk and dawn, the birds can't see it and they hit the glass wall and you find a dead bird on the grass. And I know it, sadly, I know it too well because I have that problem. And I have a house up here in Rhinebeck where my wife has been able to put these black dots all over the glass that the birds now during the day, they don't see it. But in fact, around dawn, every week or so, we hear slap and there's a dead bird at the bottom of the glass. And yeah, I think that's an unfortunate reality about you know, I mean, it's
I grew up in a glass house, so I'm very familiar with that phenomena. And
it's
it kind
sad.
of brings, it's sad. It brings up a point that I was thinking when I was seeing your video, which is, I feel like how to make a receptive surface is a key challenge for your project. It's not only the shadows and it, you know, when the glass is going to be this, you know, unwittingly become an obstacle for the birds. But I read Leah Kelly's article that I guess was distributed, which is mind-blowing about, you know, like how our cells have intelligence, which brings, you know, to science a kind of receptivity which we all feel and we all know, right? We're sensing in ways that extend beyond the senses we can name. And, you know, I feel as though the substance of your floors and your walls of catching shadows is not enough. You know, that there's different, there's a range between that and the glass, right?
Right.
Of how to create receptivity, you know, whether it's sound, whether it's light, whether it's shadow, whether it's echoes, you know, whether it's view, reflections. And you sort of want to develop a sensibility of sensitive of the surfaces and the walls and the floors having a kind of receptivity, because it's that membrane that you're trying to, you know, when you cut the paper and you lift it,
right,
you're making us aware of that thin membrane between becoming conscious and not being conscious.
Could
And
we
how
go
do you-
back? Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I agree. Could we go from the render? Yes, yes.
And it might be
Right.
from using this by making holes and drawing with a knife that you can find different receptivities of surface.
But I think, you know, I think this project could take a completely different trajectory. Could you go, I mean, from here, for example, to the next view in the model sequence, to the next view, to the next view, and then see, there's no glass yet, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
you know, if I was going to try to say, what should we do next? Let's say it's a beautiful project. And oh, by the way, Yolanda, I was really critical and I said, you've got to go inside. And then the next day later, she went inside. I said, fantastic. But now I want you to back up and get rid of Unreal Engine and ask yourself, I mean, in honor of the birds, could we build this building without glass? Or at least without the glass that birds kill themselves on? You know, I'm reading here that you've been working in Shenzhen, right?
Yes, right.
I'm building a tower there that I struggled and I've won the battle. It's glass and it's curved glass and it's fritted. And the reason it's fritted is that two things. Birds won't, you know, run into it because it's got a frit on it and it's kind of white. And at night we can blast light on this and it'll have an incredible presence at night. And Hervé de Scott is doing the lighting. But I had to fight tooth and nail for almost a year to get the frit to be on the outside of the glass. And that's the only way I can catch the light with the projecting, because if the surface is glass, it's glossy and the light won't catch on it. Anyway, it's a long story, and if you want to, I'd like to tell you about it in another time. But I really like your work. I think you're enormously talented, but I think this is a better view of your project than where you ended up.
You know,
All right.
I know we're short on time, but I just wanted to say I'm glad you asked Yolanda to go back to this image, and if you could skip to the next image as well after this. Yes,
that's great. Yeah,
because you know, when I saw these images when you were presenting, and I was listening and rereading your definition of consciousness as a contrast between, you know, there's something powerful about the contrast, but and maybe Kina was alluding to this as well, you know, what is the bridge between these two poles of the contrast, right? So if you have glass and concrete, you know, we can feel that and we can see that and we understand it, and we commend you for what you did in the renderings. But there's something that I think is softer, more delicate and more nuanced in these particular images. That, you know, as has been said, you know, just backing up a little bit and really studying that, you know, and perhaps not feeling so immediately pressured to define the exact materiality, but just allow yourself to be in the phenomena of what you created, and eventually the materiality will come, or maybe you invent a new kind of material, right? That allows you to do. Really beautiful project.
Right. Thank you so much. Should we move on, or?
Irini, are you there?
Yes, let's continue right away with Jack.
All right, thank you so much.
It's getting ready. Thank you, Yolanda.
Great work, Yolanda.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jack. Nice to meet you all. I'm going to share my screen. for the video. Sorry, one moment.
So Yolanda met Yolanda Daniels this summer in the lecture? Wasn't Yolanda
Yes,
Daniels in there? Yeah.
that's right.
Now I know two
Doesn't-
Yolandas. Okay.
Yeah, she doesn't pronounce the E though, so it's Yolanda. But you,
Yolanda.
Yolanda, you pronounce the E in the end. There we go. We can start seeing your screen slowly. There it comes.
I'm a little nervous because the audio, I don't know if the audio is going to read well. I didn't see the option to optimize the sharing with audio. If someone could help me, that'd be great.
That when
I just find it actually.
click, yes, you have to start sharing first. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. Sorry about that. I found a soapstone block in the ground. I had forgotten this piece of stone existed, and when I inspected its curious shape, I realized it was a remnant of stone carvings I had done 2 years ago. Its unearthing from the ground reminded me of the careful extrusions into the raw soapstone block that I cut to bring the sculptures out of the stone. I forgot that this would not have been possible without this remnant in the ground that had found its way to me again. I tried to imagine the raw block of stone that the 3 sculptures came from, and retraced my steps to that moment, embedding my subjectivity. Sorry, guys. I don't know. This isn't. Is it? Have the pictures been moving for you?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
and we can
they're
hear
moving.
fine.
Okay, they're not moving for me. Sorry. Okay, sorry, guys. Should I start it over?
No, you just keep going.
Keep
Okay.
going where you left off. Yes, we can follow.
Okay. Cut to bring the sculptures out of the stone. I forgot that this would not have been possible without this remnant in the ground that had found its way to me again. I tried to imagine the raw block of stone that the 3 sculptures came from, and retraced my steps to that moment, embedding my subjectivity in the object's journey to me. I imagined the block I started with, taken from its quarry, and all the ways it could have been cut, which would have influenced my possible cuts to the sculptures that eventually came out of that quarry. The ground's imprint of the remnant had registered the whole thing. The quarry is like a field where objects come from. It offers the material to create an almost endless array of objects, and the making of those objects from the field of possibilities is to create subjective links to the place and become aware of ourselves. The quarry and the field produce reflections of our subjective states. The forest is also like a field where objects come from. A forest is a field that tells you how long the material had to exist for your objects to be made real. The rings on a tree will tell you how long it's been there before it's been cut down. The quarry leaves an impression that informs us of the mass that we have just extruded. This makes it an interesting field since it tells us how much the earth had to move to make our objects. This gives us an idea of how the field is affected when we make our objects. The field is also causal. You can only carve certain objects after certain other objects so that it doesn't break. I want to use the site in a quarry-like fashion, making extrusions in the shape of the architecture. In this way, we become conscious of the work the field had to do in order to make the object. The gaps in the idyllic site are precisely the same as those we inhabit. The site becomes the image of the field after the architecture has occurred. The extrusions are inaccessible and are the image of the extraction that took place. Sorry about the difficulty with the video.
Great, great. The interior views at the end are amazing. Could you just show those once again? Just those.
Yeah. Yep.
Yes. Fantastic. Beautiful.
So the final proposal, Jack, is it's about X number of these structures, and we should see them as that they were the kind of pre-existing extractions.
Yes, exactly. The effort is really to make the sort of it's to see the site as a sort of field of possible architectures, and that it's been sort of queried out, or the architecture has been taken out of the ground, which is
without breaking the ground.
Right, exactly, and then reconstructed in the ground. Exactly. Yeah.
So sort of like, okay.
I think the project isn't really that. I think the best part of this for me is when you create these interiors and these chunks of light are cast into the inside. Could you go to that last interior? This is a field of objects, and these are spaces charged with shafts of light. And I think that's the project. I think, what, by the way, it's only 3 weeks. And we threw away his project last 2 days ago, or I don't know what, Friday or something like that. So he kind of started over. So I'm really excited about where you came. I think that these last 3 interiors are really a new project, much more powerful. And maybe it means you have to rewrite the text a bit.
Yeah, thank you.
When Jack, this sometimes a project makes you think of something as a guest or as a professor, where you're a little worried you have too much sympathy for the project and thereby you can't really be distant. Your project reminds me of many things that I found fascinating in history. But part of what I think you're bringing up is this question of something that's extracted in a way that doesn't damage or break its host. So the reason I bring that up is when I taught sophomores for years at Berkeley when I first started teaching, and I used to use lots of kind of visceral references to get across complicated things. It was fun that way. I would ask people when they were taking a bath, if they took baths, if they had a bathtub, did they get in the tub and turn the water on and let it fill up around them? Or did they fill the tub for 10 minutes and then get in after the tub was full? And you can imagine the difference. You have to slide into the water and hopefully you left enough room that the water doesn't go over the edge. But, or when a child is born, it's incrementally comes into the world from its mother. The reason I think of that is you seem to be saying that architecture in effect dilates space. When I was young, my father had angioplasty a few times. They put a balloon into your artery leading into your heart and they expand your arteries. I remember kind of, imagining that happening and watching my dad come home and say he felt fine. But ways in which architecture somehow pushes open space, a tree pushes open the soil, then that pushes open the air, and then the leaves kind of deflect light. But your drawings, the scattering of them doesn't matter about the illusion, but it reminded me pretty quickly of Aldo Rossi's early drawings of the fragments scattered. And in that sense, those drawings were often interpreted as a kind of melancholy view of a fractured society with a fractured architecture. I feel like you're describing something that's a little different. This looks chaotic, but you're saying it's effectively not disruptive.
Right.
Yeah, your little line there said, "Hey, it's a forest here. Don't displace the trees." It's as if the trees could tell architecture, "Don't tread on me."
Yeah.
Is that yeah. I think, yeah, I love what Stephen's saying. I agree with, these drawings. Yeah, to make a Doric column, it's a Boolean process. You cut it out of the stone. When Henri Labrousse makes a kind of, neoclassical column, he pours it out of iron. There's no waste. So I think you're opening up so many really powerful architectural ideas with this project.
But when actually when take it out, this quarry idea, I think is a very interesting. When you take it out, that the stone from your earth, and it actually introduced really long geological time. That when you bring that become interior, I think it's a beautiful with filled with the light and the geometry. But at the same time, I'm thinking about how we actually bring this geological time has all sorts of long time of a fissure or tension that is scratch. I think that tension seems like even though it's superficially, it's very much quiet, but once you take it out, it becomes so violent for me to see the whole geological time. So I'm wondering how we can bring that into your interior, that to embed it, the time aspect of it. And that's a kind of question to me.
Thank you very much.
What's really interesting, listening to the observations and the critical feedback, Jack, is that the more I'm looking at the contrast that you've created between these objects with interiors and then the field extractions, like the figures in the field, or the cuts, I should say, in the field, almost like these Michael Heiser pieces, much bigger than the ones that are in Dia. But, that idea of a void that you can't physically enter, but you can feel and see it. It's interesting, the contrast between the two, but I agree, the space inside is perhaps the most powerful. And one of your drawings that I think is just so beautiful is the little blue drawing. It's like a lower, that drawing is so powerful because, for some reason, when I look at that drawing, it feels like both the extraction and the object is one thing. I don't feel them as something that's been juxtaposed, like object cut. And I just feel like you've done both things with the interior. Maybe the interiors of your figures are also the extractions, like the interior. So maybe it's not so much about a binary condition, but it's like having them be embedded in one another. I think you've done it in the architecture. This sketch shows it, and I love your definition of consciousness. I think when you were showing some of those photographs of the soil, the rocks, and the cut from the soil, I think you said something about being conscious of the work or the transformation between the two. And I think you've captured that internally in the spaces.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And Jack, a few quick comments from me is, I think something very interesting here where this project, you really want to push what you call the kind of subjective qualities of the form making that you've been discovering, right? From those original soapstone pieces that you had done earlier. I think the discovery that you've made here, I'm just comparing it to like Yolanda's scheme, where with her digital renderings, all of a sudden we start to understand the role of shadow and the importance that shadow of that landscape start to play within the ground surface of the building and the way in which you would experience it. What I like about your project now is this scheme is using the architecture of the aperture to frame views of the Hudson Valley and that landscape through the subjective form making that you are interested in. And I would suggest to you that I like the way in which you're starting to kind of carve form that is starting to suggest some influence from the specifics of site, right? The way in which it acknowledges the existing trees on the landscape, the way the building kind of pushes and pulls. So I think this issue of the kind of consciousness issue is something in which what I like is I think there's an unconsciousness and consciousness that's working in your process, that you're discovering form, and you're starting to understand the kind of spatial qualities of that form. And I think that's where this project to me is very interesting, right? Because it integrates, right, form making to landscape, and when I mean landscape, I mean view, and I mean solar orientation, right? In the way in which this building moves you as you move through it, and I enjoy that a great deal.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Jack, if I may, I'm really interested in those negative spaces that you're making in the landscape with these forms. And maybe how they could, if you continued with the project, how they could communicate to the ones that that are above the ground. And maybe taking that Stephen's saying, that making a point of, this is really becoming about shafts of light, how that could influence those in the ground spaces and how they could talk to each other. I think that'd be really cool. But yeah, good job. This is awesome.
Can you show us slide maybe 21? It was the line drawing of the forms unfolding.
Is this the one?
No, maybe 20. Yeah, it was forms were unfolding.
Oh, this one?
That's that one. Yes. Is that the bottom is the bottom left, bottom right, left is a cube? Is that you're discussing an unfolding of that?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what's happening with all of them. And then, the analogy I used to use to discuss this, a friend of mine years ago, I haven't seen her in years, Karen Berman, she had gone to Cooper Union and later went out to, where'd she go? Cranbrook, when Dan Hoffman was leading Cranbrook, was quite a long time ago. But she painted chairs and furniture, hard furniture, with latex and let it dry, and then use an X-Acto to cut it. And she basically peeled the skin off the furniture and thereby turned it inside out. But we used to both use an analogy of taking a glove off your hand, and you could pull a glove off your hand from the fingers up and the glove stays intact, or you could peel it from the wrist down. And if you peel it from the wrist down, it turns inside out like a skin. Your body stays there. But if the glove had, let's say, super glue on it, that wouldn't be so easy. You might rip some skin off while you were ripping the glove off. So the reason I bring that up, as bizarre as it sounds, is when I saw this drawing, I imagined that you make shapes and the shapes meet the air, oxygen hits the paint on a wall or whatever the wall is. When you fold the wall open like that, that tension between the air, the volume, the oxygen, and the surface of the wall starts to have some tension in it. And that's where I think Stephen, I think so many of your early experiments with light, I felt like you were imagining that light cohered itself to things and things cohered themselves to light. If you anodize metal, you kind of electrically plate the surface molecules of metal, and you really do begin to bond the oxygen with the surface. If you put paint on a material, it lays there elastically, and the material and the paint don't bond except for adhesively, I guess, which is ultimately chemical. But this process of yours of kind of making a volume and then unmaking it,
right,
and is really it's hard to talk about, I'm sure, for you. I found, it's like even Tom Main once said to me, of all the things he said over many years, he once said to me, when he's finished designing something, he doesn't have anything to say about it anymore. Of course, he goes around and gives a lot of lectures, so I guess he does. But
Yeah, he talked for like 2 hours. We had a long Tom Main
but
lecture.
I love that. I love
it was
a little, he's good friends with, he used to be good friends with Herbie Hancock, and it's like I always kind of envied musicians when they leave the stage, they can kind of feel like they got it out of themselves and they can now just be human. But Jack, I feel like the ideas you're saying here, they're not just abstract, they're kind of mathematical ideas, about surfaces meeting surfaces and about volumes that aren't volumes. And, I think Kino went to Cooper Union. I'm imagining years ago talking to John Haydock, he published this somewhere, but he also said it to me once. He said when he was young, looking at Mies, he was meditating on the oxygen adhering to the surface of an I-beam. And, you know, if you think of an I-beam, if it's 4 inches by 4 inches, its actual surface area is more like 20 inches. If you trace the whole perimeter of an I-beam, as opposed to tracing the perimeter of a circle. So Jack, like if you trace the surfaces around, this drawing, I think, is quite a key to your project.
Yeah, that's very helpful for me. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, one more
Beautiful.
ridiculous story. When I was a kid, people had above ground pools. And in my neighborhood, there was a handful of above ground pools. One of them burst open one day. I was about 10 and it was full of 5-year-olds, like Eo's age. And they all went with the 18,000 gallons of water. So in other words, the volume broke and about 5 of the little kids in the neighborhood went streaming with the water and they all got caught like a strainer in the chain link fence. Nobody got hurt. But I think, Jack, I think of that, I remember that story, like if you cup space and let it go, it's like, you know, like the viscosity of the water carried these little kids. YouTube was full of images like this now. But I'm, you know. So I love being an architect because you can be very academic and you can also remember a pool breaking open. It's all legitimate as long as you can kind of control your thinking.
It's beautiful. Thank you for your comments, everyone. We have 2 more presentations to go. Reggie is up next. And
Irina, you're like air traffic control. You just keep landing the plane.
Yes.
You're very good at this. Okay.
I'd love to hear from everyone. We have a big panel. And we have people in the audience as well who may want to ask questions in the Q&A, who may not even be architects. I'm curious to see what their input may be. Reggie, are you ready?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna first share, then we can discuss it after. Our days are peppered with devices that tick and ring, buzz, jingle, and according to the rate which atoms decay in a vault half a world away. Yet time is relative. With every mechanical jolt, we often ignore the simultaneous reminder that our consciousness is measuring time counter to the atomic clock. The procession through these rough structures conveys the constant erosion and creation of one's own consciousness. This is an exploration of how architecture can persuade us into a deeper consideration of ourselves through a curated performance range. I avoided tectonic conventions that impose order and rhythm, instead utilizing primitive massings and filters that lead the procession and shape the experience. The stratoerosion of rammed earth expressed geological time. Translucent membrane, its interior light choreographed by exterior shadow and sun, is in a constant state of perpetual change. The sun across the landscape, filtered and directed by these materials, the water and the trees join our consciousness in the internal dance of impermanence. I composed the spaces according to foreshadowing and memory from the first person perspective. The rammed earth structures are primarily sundial in a variety of different levels of porosity, allowing in views or none at all, and kind of changing the scale of intimacy. And this membrane, fiberglass, probably the right material, that is sculpted, funneling. It's chaotic. It's just revolving and raveling. And then there's this this volume here at the end. It's a larger scale of strata. These two layers reflected in the pool. And this volume here is much softer. It's all indirect light, blended different temperatures from different directions. It's a place to view the landscape. And I'll take any comments from here.
Could you put that the image back up where you could see the rammed earth materiality? Yeah, where you can see the rammed earth materiality together with the fiberglass translucent materiality. You know, it's sort of a grid of the two materialities.
Were you discussing?
There, stop.
Okay.
So, you know, I think this was kind of a breakthrough because, you know, I think that you're working with the rammed earth, the notion of the strata, but then to be able to do another material that was going to allow light to come in, you know, like this whole translucent membrane, but then to have these two be in similar color palettes, this sort of, you know, sort of golden color of the translucent membrane mixed with that, you know, sort of, you know, red earth, rammed earth. I think that this particular image and the new materiality of bringing the two together is a bit of a breakthrough. I'm not sure about the plan. I don't know if the plan really works, you know, and how it sits on the site, but I find that these interiors incredibly powerful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was about to say the same. I also really like your experimentation when it comes to materiality, and it's something I wanted to say in the previous project where we ran out of time, and certainly also in Yolanda's project. In like a kind of 3-week time frame, or within like the 3-week context, you really got to figure out what point you want to make and what you want to bring across, like at your, you know, let's just say final presentation, or what you would like to have discussed. When I look at your project, you do want to have light discussed, you want to have weight discussed, and you want to have color discussed. And those are 3 extraordinarily profound things to start to work with and to start to experiment with. And the focus here is really, I think, like experimentation. Where you're going to take it is, I guess, going to be a key question. That image here or the one before are quite outstanding, because you start to look at questions of how do I get into it? What am I going to do with the spaces? How am I going to organize it? And also, how is it going to be built? You work in a very painterly way. And one of our friends that we're missing today, Dr. Mark Morris, who wrote this incredible piece that I sometimes like to bring up, called Painterly Urbanism, for a book called Urban Hopes, which has like Stephen's work in there. Something you really should look up. Like, if you can't get a hold of the book, like, send me an email, I send you the article itself. There's a very particular, in a very short period of time, when you kind of like move pigment around, and when you quote unquote move space around before it becomes volume. It's a very, very different way of designing than you drawing lines and borders, right? Like, you draw a line with a pencil, it's very, very definitive. You move pigment around, it takes a bit of time in order to absorb, but then also to contextualize. But you're building spaces. I couldn't help but think about what you're doing spatially when you showed your film. You're not like limiting or creating just like rooms and programs, but you're spatially working. I would really love to see, and I made this comment at the very, very beginning, how and if this has an impact on how you change materiality, even though your project, Reggie, is a very material-based one. But like, how would this work if site specificity becomes part of your material decisions? Like in the previous project, right? Like that kind of carving of the stone. Like, what is that stone moment, like in you cutting into the clay or wax or whatever you used here in your modeling? So I probably, coming from like left outside here, I like that experimental nature with something that is actually very specific as you start to organize your project.
So I agree. I mean, you know, you're thinking through material and through the physical presence of these things that you have in front of you. And I feel like if you were to continue, you would have to invent something other than fiberglass. I've worked in fiberglass. I'm familiar with its stink and its very creepy relationship to you when you work with it, and then even afterwards. And so, you know, ideally, I mean, it's lovely, the layers of trace, you know, it's almost, but you can invent, I mean, I would encourage you to experiment with material that is translucent, that is resinous. You know, it could be glues that you create and you find and you form, but because your expression is so much through material, this requires a material that I think you would have to invent. You know, ideally it would be amber, right? But it can't be. It can't be amber.
You know, Kim, I love what you're, sorry to jump in. I really, really love what you're saying, because it's something that is so present today in this really beautiful, beautiful projects that's so often so lost, right? If I think about a conversation in terms of like, how do we make architecture and making, you're really inventing it as you're doing it. And it was a very, very interesting conversation, not like that long ago in you know, the kind of like surroundings that you're working in, right? Like in terms of like, how do I create enclosure? How do I create space? How do I create a project that's a little bit more than just like organizing like program, right? And to start thinking about material and methodology is really, I mean, you own it, right? Like, and nobody else, in fact, like knows how to do it either until you start to do it, right? Like rammed earth is one of those things that, like, I mean, the stuff has been around for so many years, like makes one's hair fall out. And it has such a renaissance to actually see it in every single person. Things like we have a rammed earth project right now. But like, what is that like rammed earth for you? I like that I think Kina hit the nail on the head here. I mean, there's more to it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're trying to make a crystallis, right? That the butterfly is in. And I mean, that's like, you know, kind of this moment of metamorphosis that maybe is behind what you're thinking of in terms of consciousness, this breaking through to a transformative state. And it has such a wonderful counterweight to the rammed earth, what you want, but there isn't a material existing. It's something that I think, you know, is one that you have to develop and find. And it may be something that, you know, has to be rebuilt, like the Issei Shrine. It might not be permanent. It might intentionally be something that only lasts a year and has to be rebuilt.
I love that idea. I love the concept of impermanence in architecture, and I think it's so often that we are imposing permanence architecture, and we're not considering that something doesn't very rarely last more than a generation.
You know, I don't want to let you off the hook here. This is a comment you probably will find very few people to disagree with, right? Like the kind of, I mean, we all love impermanence, right? Like maybe because our lives are so impermanent, but like there is also something to be said about how do you think about materials that by definition are permanent, and how do they actually hold up, like architecturally and programmatically, for what we do as architects also to be somewhat a bit more permanent. We actually have sometimes like a reverse problem. You end up with all these plastics, they don't go away in a million of years. You look at like building technology and details, the way stuff is built, where cost takes over. So stuff doesn't last actually all that long. And like you end up with something that may need to be replaced after 10 years, whereas you actually really would like it to last 100, right? So permanence and impermanence is a really, I think, powerful conversation when the adaptability of it really takes shape programmatically the way you're doing. I mean, Michael would probably be a much, much better person to speak, where you sometimes like need to actually look at things that like move, like your work with Tesla, and like where fiberglass is used very differently that we as architects like we're thinking about before you started to do the studios, Michael. I always find this quite interesting.
Well, I'm thinking of the first. Oh, go on.
Oh, go ahead.
Go on, John.
Yeah, just quick. Since Christoph was mentioning about the material, and also at the beginning you said it's not tectonic, and I think it's kind of required almost. You are already into this tectonic, not necessarily overall building, but when you engage the way how you layered paper. I don't know what material will be later, but those things, not necessarily all the idea of tectonic with the structure, with the detail, with a lot of things assembled. But I think you probably engage in order to get to your new your concept. I think it requires a new tectonic. Therefore, it's not about just searching the new material, but also it requires a new way of assemble, which is, I think, is not panel or the object, but it seems like a layer of the material that it really achieved the whole transparency as well as strengths of the structure. So it's not necessarily structure and the envelope is a separate. I think that next level, it's definitely, I'm thinking about for the next level, how do you move on? Not necessarily as Christoph were concerned about this plastic or frame, paneling, structure, but it can be something new way of assemble the whole material. I think that seems like a really interesting idea.
I agree. Can we see it from above or something that shows the overall order more? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is good. So when you move through this, I mean, you have to arrive. You've arrived in the Hudson Valley and you've arrived at Bard and you got out of a car, right? So thank you. That's perfect. But are there moments where you cycle back? If I could annotate the screen, I'm thinking about the flow. So do I do this? And here, if I go over to here, then I have to cycle back to go to here, or is this a decision point?
Yeah. I was kind of considering this area right here is kind of a subjunction of different choices.
So if I go one way and then finish whatever I was doing, I would go through there again to get to the other place.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, kind of the way I ordered these were a compromise between going one direction or the other. I mean, you could enter from this other direction and do things in reverse. And
right.
Yeah.
Okay. That's
And when something is in perspective, kind of in this main alley of spaces, it's either foreshadowing what you do or it's memory of what you did do.
yeah. And then your concepts about permanence and or not, and degrees of permanence, and question about amber and translucency, all of that helps dissolve the permanence of the structure, either just in the moment, like light gets through, so the structure is less permanent, and the thing might not last 1,000 years. But so there's the procession of time, and then your light and everything else is dissolving time too, right? I don't mean to say right, like you should agree with me, but okay.
Yeah, you put it more beautifully than I could.
No. So I'm just, I mean, when I was a kid in undergrad, and Tom Schumacher, my teacher at Catholic University, showed me, Turani, but he also showed us Villa Savoye, like every other student. But I remember distinctly thinking, if I go to the top of the building, I have to turn around and then go back down and, exit the way I came in effectively. But I think time is really obviously on your mind in material and translucency and light, and just even being able to approach a building from multiple entries. I'm thinking of Stevens, Nelson Atkins. You can kind of go through the building in various ways. But so why am I saying that? It's aside from the fact that it's relatively obvious, I do often think that we intuitively know much more about ourselves as people and as designers than we realize. And that school and architecture in particular require us to tap into this kind of demonstrative side. I said X and I did Y. I said Y and I did Z. I'm a professional. I'm responsible. I'm an academic and I'm being responsible. But of course, I'm talking about poetry and loss and life. And so finding the balance between being demonstrative versus saying to yourself, I don't really quite know what I'm doing, but I feel like I'm doing the right thing. So I feel like you absolutely know what you're doing. Part of what I was getting at, where I was wondering was, I wonder if you could have a whole lot less architecture. Like, why? Because I'm thinking of the transformation of consciousness question and what it means to different people in the class, what it means to the people teaching. And one thing that I felt like it means is that after you go through something architecturally, whatever it is, that there's an aftermath and you are indeed transformed, or something is transformed. And I often think that that might occur in a way after you've kind of washed the architecture off you. And now it's you that's transformed. So I wonder if the extent to which a lot of these buildings are imagining the motion through induces something. And once that's complete and you leave, there's something different going on. So I could talk a lot more about why I say it that way, but the first project, I felt like there was a kind of cathartic crisis going on in the music that was being transposed into the architecture. It's like after you leave Raging Bull, you feel differently. After Scorsese and Robert De Niro had their way with your 2 hours. So that, I think that you're really onto something very interesting, but it does feel like you're immersed. Like if I go here, I'm immersed. And that might be important and necessary. Like if you went to Fermini Chapel, Le Corbusier, the version that was completed by José Aubrière, I went there right after it was finished, and that building definitely feels like an immersion more than Villa Savoye does, to me. So I wonder if once you're immersed, would you come back out of this, and maybe there could be less architecture, not the. I would if I was critical, I would worry you don't want to create ambiance the way somebody creates ambiance in a restaurant. That you're trying to create something that's immersive but remains somehow mathematically lucid. Like if a physicist looks at something happening like mud sliding down a hill, they see the mud sliding and they worry about getting dirty. They also imagine the cohesion of the molecules in the clay. So I feel like you're doing that. You're imagining the mathematics of this, and you're also imagining the feel and the immersion. What is the
Wait,
molecular cooking?
may I suggest we move on to Megan's presentation, and then we can have a conversation overall of the projects. Thank you.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Can you guys see yourselves?
No.
Okay, good. All right. So this design seeks to transform the individual's consciousness through the evocation of the sublime as one sequences through the deconstruction and reconstruction of Platonic form. As a glass artist, my pursuit of the sublime was informed by a lifelong fascination with the phenomenal qualities of blown glass. Engaging in this material exploration, I sought to manifest as an architectural experience the deconstruction of form as it is abstracted by the slumped surface of glass. Inspired by Plato's Timaeus, in which he defines the universal Platonic solids as the building blocks from which all further forms and sensations are derived, I began my material explorations with the Platonic solids as my formworks. A series of study models were made in an attempt to engage solid and void and the space in between. So in beginning to stitch these disparate object spaces together, an object field was formed by the sections of layered walls, was then introduced to define a structural logic, as well as organize a sequence between the Platonic solids and the transitive state spaces of surface in between. In citing the project, I once again referenced Plato's Timaeus as I interpreted the creation of the disordered universe as the translation of an objective composition of Platonic solids into a new context. Deconstruction is used as an organizational strategy as both the object field and the object are shifted and displaced in acceptance of the site's 100-year-old trees. The displacement is materialized and frozen in time through the layering of slumped glass surfaces. The layered structural walls give room for nature's participation, serving at times as the foundation for the remaining Platonic solids, as well as an exterior skeleton for the slumped glass surfaces. Glass is further used as a phenomenal lens to reflect and fracture light, context, and space. Moving through the space, the presence of forces from past or future times is evoked to transform the individual's consciousness as they attempt to fill the spatial gaps between what might have been and what is. Thank you.
Can we look at the last image again?
Yes, here I'm pulling up PowerPoint.
So I'm curious. I mean, I really, you know, the notion of transformation of the Platonic solids is something I think that's at the core of this, and I feel it happening here. But if you go back one more slide, this looks like a different project. So I mean, in other words, there's so many elements, so many things going on in this one compared to, you know, 39 and 40. This feels like 30, this feels like 40, 38 feels like 40. In other words, I'm not sure. Yeah, can you say something about that? I mean, that's part of your project. I mean, in a way, it's like, I'm really happy to see the interiors, by the way. I think the interiors are very important because when you start the whole thing from the outside and you're melting, it's great. But then you have to, I mean, architecture, you have to go inside of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just wonder your own opinion about the difference, the radical difference between the nature of number 39 and number 38 and number 40 in terms of interior experience.
Yeah, well, the pursuit of the design was sort of to create that contrast and to sequence the individual through them so that you sort of understand once you are within sort of moving from this like fractured transitive state of relation that is sort of has the traces of the Platonic objects, you then arrive again at sort of that universal form. And I guess I suppose I was hoping to sort of evoke a consciousness of when you arrive at that universal form, you're sort of like reminded of a sort of universal world in which you exist. And so these spaces are meant to be sort of more objective and connecting the individual to the whole. And then these spaces are meant to be more subjective and sort of fractured.
There is something for you to bite into though, Megan, in terms of like when do they create like inspiring opposition visually versus when do they align to allow you to contextualize tectonically as a viewer, if this makes sense to you. There is also, and like I totally sympathize with your project, by the way, because it's just, I think, extraordinarily well executed for whatever that means. I also love the way you start with your glass blowing analog to the degree that I would almost hope you would try to now glass blow your final model and or certain elements of it. And like, I'm that serious about it because it's not, you know, we could go into the whole conversation about like the limitations of something like liquid, like a temperature, like volumetricness and like thickness and like how much can you control like the blow, so to say. But like, I think it could be extraordinarily productive here in terms of what you do spatially. It's nothing short of extraordinary, and like it's almost like easy to forget and not talk too much about your sections and elevations, like 27 to all the way to throughout like 30. It's hard to have those compete with your interior images, but they're also really, really powerful the way you start to, again, like create context from what you want us to do programmatically versus how it presents itself. There's one, and like, I'm really curious what my friends and colleagues have to say here, but like there's one thing I would like to give you on your way, and I'm I'm passing this on almost because I've been told that many times back in the day at Cooper, for lack of a better example, which was like, don't like rest on using somebody else's philosophy in order to justify some of your moves. And, you know, I was very obsessed at that point with like Bergson and all of this. I don't even know why I'm like bringing this up now, but like, you know, you almost don't need like, oh, you know, I'm fascinated by like, I don't even know, like the disorder of the universe and this and that. It's all like true, but like start to read your own work. And like, I'm only saying this, Megan, because you're so far along so early on that like spend a little bit of time in like thinking about what your project does in you doing it architecturally, but also how do I start to understand it? How do you start to understand it theoretically? So I would like, you know, a different conversation for a different time. Would love to know what you're actually reading, you know, what's on your table, like how deep do you dive in order to then start to write your own stuff. Something to be said about many projects here, but anyway, I'm gonna shut up now. Congrats.
Christoph, that's really beautiful. You know, you were mentioning the kind of range of work in here, from the plans and sections to the final renderings. And I had a question for you, Megan. At the very beginning, did you say you're a glass blowing artist? I'm sorry, I missed that part. Or are you currently a student of architecture?
Oh yeah, I'm a student. I was a glass artist before I went to architecture school, but I'm in my third year of architecture school.
Well, wasn't this glass slumping, Megan? You were talking about glass slumping, not blowing.
Yeah, I'm a like I blow glass, but in terms of this exploration, because I was sort of limited, I was more interested in sort of the slumping process with the surfaces.
You know, it's really beautiful. I'm glad you mentioned that because, you know, if I think, first of all, you know, huge congratulations. I mean, 3 weeks of work. I mean, it's like a thesis project here. And I really think you invented for yourself a process of form making and space making that's very authentic to you. It comes out of your experience, but I think you're also learning something new. And I think the fact that you embraced Platonic geometry, right, as the voice against this kind of liquid forming is really beautiful. And I've noticed that in a number of the projects today, that there seems to be a really beautiful contrast between heavy, thicker, inert material and then a more thin or light or viscous kind of material or fluid material, I'll say. And, you know, I really think you found something here. I mean, in 16, 16, 17, 18, I mean, there's an incredible proposition there, right? Because you're saying the glass actually is the primary structural element, right? You know, the volume is being suspended or supported by the glass. If we go back to what we were talking about in Yolanda's project about an hour ago, where we were trying to figure out, you know, how to get the glass maybe to either disappear or do something else, right? This is potentially something else, right? The glass is not where we necessarily expect it to be as a kind of wrapper or a kind of skin around something, but it's now spatial, structural, and it's moving towards the sky. And, you know, again, I know this is very different from what you ended up with in the end, but I think all of these projects are so, you know, you guys are in a great position because there is the final proposition that you made for today. But if you go back through the work that you've made over the last 3 weeks, you know, you guys have really created a whole catalog of ideas that you can explore for years, if not decades. So I just want to say congratulations to you and to your classmates for really just going in there and digging out something that's so fresh and unique and new. Wow.
I'd like to emphasize what Anthony said. Could we go back to those same views that you were pointing out? And I would also say that on 16, 17, 18, that sequence, that 6-slide sequence, there's the most amazing project because of all the reasons that Anthony said, and that clarity is not there in the final project. So I that's what I was trying to ask about. And I think that you could edit out and you know, you could keep working on that final to try to get some of this raw, pure, you know, confounding energy that's in this sequence here. I think And you know, I think that's what a 3-week exercise is all about. Is you produce a lot of things, and then at the end of it, you take you take an assessment. And I think there's a lot of work here, and it's fantastic. And I also think that at the end, though, I mean, I want to be honest. I don't think the end project is as strong as this moment right here. So, and then the question is why? I mean, the question is, it gets a little too complex inside, you know? And
well, I feel like I agree with everything that everyone's saying, but I feel that you can, and it's with the time you were given, it's fine. But if you had more time, you can be more articulate in developing your own philosophy.
Right.
Instead of relying on someone others, and to sort of provoke that. Slumping glass, there's a mold that's resistant, right? And the glass almost slumps, you know, there's a gap, right? And the same with your heat gun on the plastic. You know, with slip casting, there's a slurry. And there's certain forms that work with slip casting that adhere to the mold, and others that don't. Blowing glass, there may be a mold on the outside, but the force is coming from the inside. But all of these processes have a force. They have something that is a resistor. They lend themselves to certain forms, but not others. And they relate to things in nature. Like if you think of a green pepper, it's very much like a slip cast object that holds up its own, you know, it has structural integrity. And there is a force of growth, right? That is similar to the air blowing into a glass, you know, when you make a vessel. So there is already a kind of set of terms, a vocabulary, a syntax. There's forces, there's internal, external molds, you know, which might refer to what you were seeking, which is what might have been and what is, you know, so that there's this gap between what might have been and what is, which might be the mold and the force, and the material is what's in between these things that can reach, you know, the limits or be affected by the force. So I feel like you have this language that you can be very articulate with in terms of developing your own philosophy, to sort of filter through everything you did with a kind of conceptual lens, with such authority coming from you and not someone else, some other authority like the philosopher that you might have started with. You become the authority within the work.
And it's a beautiful, when you think about the problems of the language of architecture today, all 6 of these projects are working on the language of architecture vis-a-vis the students' personal investigation vis-a-vis this 6,000 square foot pavilion. And I think this is terrific. I mean, I find that the moment that we're in right now, I mean, in the 1930s, there was the emergence of the international style. So the 5 points of architecture of Le Corbusier, the strip window, the pilotis, the roof terrace, you know, there was a language of architecture that was being established, a certain clarity. And then also with Mies, you know, the notion of steel frame, and then Philip Johnson copies Mies with that language he was given by Mies van der Rohe. Today, you know, we're after the deconstruction has dissipated, and we're in a moment of complete freedom. So each student has the chance to really, you know, play their own cello and do their welding together, right? I mean, this is a very exciting moment in architecture. And I was very happy to see 2 great students come from Pittsburgh, right? Is Gerard still there? Did he have to leave?
Yeah, it's very much
Still here.
attributed to Gerard and Jose.
Gerard, could you say something about what you're doing in Pittsburgh and the language of architecture and how it relates to our program here?
Well, Jose and I are firm believers in helping the students understand what is the kind of DNA of architecture, what kind of ties it all together, and ultimately it's about the ideas, right? And you know, representation continues to move at a rapid pace, but to kind of boil it down, to try to understand that there's a kind of DNA that's kind of connected through time about architecture,
Right.
And trying to have the students understand that and start to gain some knowledge of it, it allows them to have great freedom, right? Because they understand that they're part of a trajectory.
Right.
And that they're not alone, right? But so that's a little bit of what we do here. And I think in Megan's scheme and in Brian's scheme, one thing I'm really proud to see is they really understand that sequential ideas are really important, that you're stitching architecture together like a film, right? And the way in which we move through space, right? And the way we manipulate space is absolutely essential, right? To making the experience for people, and how it really, as was mentioned in this review, how it, when you leave a piece of architecture, it sticks with you, it casts a shadow on you, right? And it affects you. And so,
and it's not just the language, you know, that we're working on. It's the materiality that gives that language validity. In other words, you know, there's this, I mean, it's coming down to the basic, almost like the pre-theoretical ground of architecture that needs to be re-explored today, you know. I mean, I loved Yolanda's project. However, I'm very concerned that today, you know, when I enter a competition, the other 5 firms, they're all doing like super digital renderings and they have no materiality. And surprise, surprise, there wasn't even an idea behind the design and there's no plan in section. So the thing that we're trying to get across here, and I think is part of this studio, is these basic things. And I think Yolanda's project, when she was cutting the paper and doing the planar explorations, and I was criticizing it, and then suddenly she got inside of it, it became really exciting. But in the end, I'm nervous about Unreal Engine modeling done in animation itself without doing plans and sections and without more carefully articulating the idea. That is, in a nutshell, where we are with the architecture schools today. Most people have to just do a digital rendering and you know, and an animation, and there's no talk about what is the language they're using. In fact, that's happening in the basic firms that are even copying each other. You know, I mean, it's a strange moment that we're existing in. So I really am excited about this studio because we have a chance to come back to ground zero in a way.
And you said, I have to highlight this, Stephen, you said it's almost a pre-theoretical.
Yes, a
ground.
pre-theoretical ground.
Thank you.
That's,
Thank you.
yeah. Actually,
yeah.
I did a lecture at SciArc called Pre-Theoretical Ground in about 1993. And if you Google SciArc and the history of their lectures, you can hear me much thinner. Actually, I weighed 50 pounds lighter and no gray hair. And I was talking about pre-theoretical ground, and I don't know, I still feel that's important. I you know, it's like Luke Kahn said, what I'm interested in is volume 0, you know, the beginning.
Sure. Yep. Well, it's interesting, like looking at Reggie's project and thinking about the role of the primitive, right? And that the primitive is highly sublime, right? I mean, it's the way in which you start to kind of interpret it. You know, if you think about the most primitive structures about getting away from the elements, but in fact, it has a spatial quality, right? And us as architects, and I think it's really important in the way when students travel and when we travel and we look at these buildings and we look at these spaces, whether they be built by architects or whether they be built by nature, right? They affect us in some way. And I think as an architect, learning how to be observant of those conditions, right? It is the great power of, I think is the great power of architectural education, what it needs to do, right? You need to be that kind of inquisitive nature of understanding that there's that kind of connection between the most primitive structure and the most modern structure, right? If they have meaning, right?
That's right.
You know, Gerard, in that case, feels like you're describing in the context of what was being discussed before, from Tina discussing force and something, or partially something of glass, and Stephen pre-theoretical. You're bringing that up because one could see qualities of architecture or experience that you didn't cause to be. In other words, they're already there.
Right.
Can we go to slide 16 that Stephen had focused on?
Sure.
I think it's slide 16.
Yeah.
Was that 6 sequence slides? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, right there. Yeah, I put in chat. It's, you know, forgive the illusions. When I saw this, an image popped in my mind of Marc Chagall painting floating people, and I put a link to it. But you know, you're not doing Marc Chagall, and you didn't bring that up, so I don't necessarily shouldn't or don't need to bring it up. But if this, whatever want to call it, I thought of it as a, you know, partially slumped glass, you know, force that didn't quite finish. But if that is between X and Y, then it's an interim space. And when Stephen was focusing on this and the discrepancy, that kind of 3 different qualities of that in glass at the end of your project, for a moment, I wondered if you could lose both sides of the equation and only keep that. And it's not because I think it'll be a better building or a better project, but it's the degree to which already in that form, if whatever one calls it, there is a whole set of antecedents and precedents. You know, the glass had to be made, the glass was planar, the glass had to have force in the quality of heat applied to it. It you know, went through a dichotomy of different ways. But, you know, my mind was racing, you know, in the Chagall paintings, people are floating. How do people float? They're somewhere between divine and human, of course. But whatever Chagall was telling us, I thought maybe what you're really after is not so much using the slumped or molded glass to let light in that shows itself up in the last image against wood. Thing is, where's your last image? Can we see your final? Yeah, right here. In the final image, things are kind of effectively grounded again. The person can end up on the sidelines, they can witness the phenomena, and you're effectively safe from it. As opposed to, let's say, a surfer on a huge wave in Portugal. You know, so I feel like part of what's going on with your project, and maybe this language that Stephen's talking about discovering, might not be at either end of the resolution or the instigation, but in the process. You know, it's not to hold you to something and say, oh, you chickened out and didn't do the real thing. But, you know, forgive this ridiculous story. When I was an undergrad, I think I heard the term metaphysics about 1,000 times. And I remember sitting in the audience, you know, wondering, well, I think I know what metaphysics is, but I really have no idea. One day I came across a book that compiled Aristotle writings. And as I recall, I think chapter 11 was physics and chapter 12 was metaphysics, or it might have been 12 and 13. But, you know, in physics, there's force and counterforce. And as much as physics is complicated, especially if you get to string theory or something, in metaphysics, the term I recall at that point was the unmoved mover, the force that didn't have a force. And you know, that's either in a theological world, it becomes God. In a kind of physicist world, perhaps it's the Big Bang. But this question of force without counterforce, or the force that didn't result from another force. So ever since then, I must say, you know, if architecture kind of posits A and B, and in between is the result of the force of B on A and A on B, you know, that can get really complicated, but it is physics. And I feel like what you're doing in that interim space and Kina helped me see this, if you put force on the glass in the form of heat, but you don't complete the transformation, it's either just you're not done or you don't want to complete it. You're interested in the force kind of ending without the counterforce of the mold. I don't mean to throw out some huge concept in 5 minutes. Oh, by the way, here's Aristotle on physics and metaphysics. That's ludicrous to do. But that little, you know, of all the great teachers I had in my life, that little reading of chapter 12 and then chapter 13, force and counterforce, and oh, by the way, how about the unmoved mover? So that, to me, if we go back to slide 16, that's where, I mean, architecture does ground things. Yeah, in slide 16, that strikes me like, you know, the glass is slumping, but it's also still stiff enough. It's quasi-cantilevered. So it's slumped and then it regained strength. You know, so I do think this is smart stuff. So, but I think the true experiment is there. And anyway, it doesn't.
So I think Michael's diversion into metaphysics and physics is a good one, because when we're making a small project, it's only 6,000 square feet. It's a little pavilion. We're working on the language, but we're trying to have projecting into a deeper thinking, right? So, and I think when I think about this project, I say, what is it about certain Platonic solids that you never can get out of your head? We're on our way to Rome. We're going to fly to Rome on the 2nd of August. I'm going to take my 5-year-old daughter into the Pantheon, right? I mean, what is the power of that 30-foot in diameter circular opening on the top of that building? It is so powerful, you just can't believe it. And the purity of the spherical volume, and in the 2,000 years old. I mean, there's something, Anyway, I feel like this sequence of the 6 images there's a connection there. I wouldn't want to lose that connection. I mean, I found it the beautiful that you put
It's like the light burned its way through.
Right, but when she was making her presentation, she put that famous sketch of Le Corbusier of the Platonic solids at the beginning of her. Could we go back to that sketch?
Yes, I have that in the video.
Oh, all right. Anyway, it's Le Corbusier's famous sketch of the Platonic solids, right? There are certain universal things that don't go away. I mean, and yes, what is it about Rome that is so powerful? The Piazza Navona. I mean, I mean, it's just, and you can keep going back, and that's where I started architecture. I was 21 years old, and I was mesmerized, and it was the interior spaces, not the outsides, right? It was the interior sensations, the incredible sensations. And I just want to point out another thing that happened that I was really excited about. I think it was with Brian, and he said something about red shadows. Can you see me? Can you see my video here?
Yeah.
Well, this book, this little tiny book, In Praise of Shadow by Tanizaki, I hope everybody in our studio now can get this little paperback and read it. But when he said red shadows, then I said, oh, you got to read this book from 1934. I mean, it's about phenomena, it never goes away, the reflection, the glossiness, I'm sure Kina Lesky has read this book, right, Kina?
I will.
You haven't read this?
No, I haven't.
Oh my God, I thought John Haydock would bring this to everybody. Anyway, it's a beautiful little read, an afternoon in the sunlight. It's great. And now I'm going to take with me Seneca on the shortness of light. Seneca, and the poet Robert Kelly recommended Greek folk religion, okay? And then here's something I've never read, which I will read, Epictetus, Discourses. So I have like 4 paperbacks. I could put them in my suitcase, and I'll have some really heavy duty reading while I'm in Rome and Greece. And I don't know if that's a conclusion from me. I mean, I'd like to say that there were 6 great projects. They're working on the language. I love the fact that we connect deeply to Pittsburgh and Gerard's program. And I feel like we connected to John Haydock through Kina and through Anthony Titus. Right, Anthony?
It's a great afternoon, really fantastic work. And, just one little tidbit on physics and consciousness, there's a biophysicist and neuroscientist by the name of Christoph Koch, and his primary definition of consciousness is that it is a physical entity. Wow. And basically, to boil it down to a nutshell, as far as I understand, what defines consciousness is basically degrees of distinction and degrees of integration. And I think all of the projects today just fantastically made the argument that perhaps architecture is the seat of consciousness. So congratulations to every beautiful work.
Yeah, we could go on and on about consciousness, but the reason I give that book, The Praise of Shadows, after you read that book, I guarantee you will look at shadows differently, In Praise of Shadows. And that's about consciousness. That's about being conscious of something, right? Transformation of our consciousness.
That book was passed around at Berkeley a lot by Tony Dubovsky. The other day I was looking at a shadow and just noticing that you could, they're transparent. They don't entirely occlude everything. When we used to draw shadows with black ink, they occluded everything. They actually are, as is it Brian said, transparent.
And in the snow up here in Rhinebeck in the wintertime, your shadows are blue. If the sunlight is out, then the sky is blue. Your shadow on the snow is blue. It's beautiful.
You can put a mirror on the snow at reflecting the sky, and it will be the same color as that shadow, because it's pure reflection of the sky. But I think I really appreciate this crowd of people that is here, because and this understanding of almost a priori theory, almost, because I'm coming from a recent shift where I teach, which is, heavy theory before you look, before you feel, before you make, before you touch. And, theory, I think its etymology, I'd have to go back and do some research. I think it goes back to viewing and seeing, and it has to do with phenomena in theater. It is an experiential root of just like you're looking at the blue reflected sky in a shadow. That's a mini theater.
Right.
And
I think one of the things I've learned, I have a 5.5-year-old daughter, and she will stop and look at an insect and see a whole, Baba, look at this. And I look, and it's just a worm on the ground, but she's mesmerized with the thing. And it makes you realize what we need. I think we all need to transform our consciousness is the mind of a 5-year-old, really. We have to have a child's mind when we see things and not know what they are and ask questions about them. And I think that architecture is about that, right? And
remaining curious.
It's fantastic, right? Gerard, what are those?
I like that last
Gerard,
point about.
I have to ask that question to Gerard. Oops, Dimitra, go ahead.
No, I like the last question. That whole conversation now at the end is fantastic, and I like this whole point about theory and the consciousness. After all, whose consciousness are we talking about, if not ours, really? And not just as architects to try to transform somebody else's consciousness while experiencing a building or architecture, but that point of our consciousness being transformed, therefore affecting maybe others, the way we look at work or the way they would then experience the work. And I also wanted to say about Megan's work that I think she's still really, really close to her glass making process. It could be a light fixture. It could become, like I see the work, does it have to be a pavilion, a 6,000? I know it had to become a pavilion, but maybe it isn't, and maybe we arrived to something else. I don't know. I just want to be very open about everybody's work, because it's in that range of consciousness that we would be allowed to rethink everything.
Dimitra, just to add to that, I love that you bring that up at the end. When I was young, I was a graduate student at Berkeley. There was a graduate program at UC Santa Cruz called the History of Consciousness. Mark Rakutansky was a student in that program before he studied architecture. And, I remember all of us walking around Berkeley going, what the hell's a program? What's that? What the hell's how do you get a degree in the history of consciousness? And you could also get a degree in rhetoric back then too, which you can today, but there was so much work that appealed to architectural thought, conceptual work in rhetoric, linguistics, consciousness, mathematics, geometry, of course, which is always there. So linking architecture to painting, as much as they're brother and sister, there was this whole other set of things to link it to. And today, of course, people talk about money and politics and everything else. But so I would say what Dimitra brought up is so important is if you do come back to consciousness, yeah, whose consciousness? What I thought what was so powerful here in many of these projects that is really relevant is I think at some level intuitively all of you were dismantling interiority. You know, as soon as you made an inside, you were making its counter or its other. And in that sense, it felt like consciousness is something that's transitory and that it's people in motion. And maybe even they go to your building and they leave. And whatever happens, happens later. And maybe the relationships between people kind of occur differently later. I'm misremembering this, but years ago when Rafael Moneo was talking about architectural autonomy, as was Peter Eisenman and Gando Sonas and Diana Agreste and others, you know, later they really had to legitimize that. You know, autonomy was a form of negligence or narcissism, it was often said. But I remember Michael Hayes in particular, Moneo, saying, if you could understand what architecture can do, you can then imagine using it. And I'm paraphrasing. So Stephen, I think when you talk about this language or, you know, pre-theoretical, it's, you know, can you find out what architecture is capable of doing and or being or something, and you can then release it into the world as opposed to deriving it and using it for a known purpose. When you're talking about theories, Tina and Stephen, it isn't like, you know, like theoretical physics when it emerges, in particular with people like Ernst and not Ernst, well, Einstein, but even before Einstein, the idea of being able to theorize the presence of something, but not visually confirm it or know it empirically. And thus physics stops being about arches and starts being about, well, astrophysics. So in other words, you guys are all today, we're like mixing physics and forms and weight and material in the known quantities, like materials degrade. And then it seemed like the consciousness part was pulling it into something that is cognitively possible and at some level outside of the known world. You were giving a real privilege to the consciousness part. You know,
Michael, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why are you always in front of Ellsworth Kelly's art?
I
love that piece.
It's a good backdrop.
What's your consciousness on that juxtaposition?
Well, you know, I actually am embarrassed to be in front of that because I think it's a kind of, you know, segmentary, incremental work of art, meaning
it's beautiful.
It's beautiful, but it's discrete pieces that then, you know, flow once you kind of bring them into the brain. I was going to switch it to something that I like more, but doesn't work. What do you think?
It's like a musical staff. Sure. It's held together by the 5 staff lines.
It is, but I would prefer Cold Mountain, that's far more topological. Yeah,
and there's
much closer to this class. Yeah,
but there's a consciousness that comes completely from the reading of Red Pine.
Yeah. But it's the degree to which, you know, I mean, either one of these things is real in terms of paint on canvas or, you know, laser cut aluminum. In many of the projects today, you know, these projects went from something discrete to something that's flowing, you know, calculus. So, you know, the water in the river flowing, you know, and the Marden thing is flowing in. Anyway, you know better than I. You know, very smart. But this one makes you look like you're insane if you use that as a screensaver. Yeah. Why do I bring all that up though? But the language of architecture and what is the use of theory and something that's pre-theoretical. If you can do work that actually precedes, you know, Stephen Toomey, like you used to often say, there's no architecture without a concept. And I would say, Bernard, what if you have some architecture for which there is no concept? In other words, the concept will be born of the architecture. So it's pre-theoretical, it's even pre-concept. We're always using concepts to make architecture, but can you do work that then gives birth to the concept?
You know, I had this argument with Richard Nonis one time. Bless his soul, he died this year, but he's the great sculptor that did the line here at T-Space. I wish everybody was here so we could walk out in the landscape now and look at Richard Nonis's 900-foot long, you know, line in our landscape across the trail. I hope you will all have a time sometime to come and visit T-Space and walk the landscape trail. But Richard and I were sitting down with Mike Metz, the sculptor, and in an argument about, and I said, but you know, some art has no ideas, you know, like the paintings of de Kooning, the late paintings of de Kooning. There are no ideas in those paintings. And Richard Nona snapped back, abstract art is already an idea. That was a good one, huh? That got me.
Yeah, it takes a lot. Dimitri would
No,
know.
he was, Richard was really good. Richard was the best. All right.
Hey, can we take a picture all together?
Yes.
Yes.
We have to promote that this happened on our social media.
Oh
Okay.
God, or else it didn't happen. Yeah.
Exactly.
You sound like you run Colombia. Okay.
Okay, 1, 2.
Yolanda, there you are. Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Awesome. Thank you, guys.
A rare Zoom moment where all of us are laughing. This was fantastic. I'm very, very, very excited and very, very thankful for this experience. I can't wait to meet you in person and give each one of you a hug.
And I'm just sending you all,
yes.
I'm sending you all, I just signed my latest little book about sketches and poems and process. And I just dedicated one to each of you. 6, I just signed 6 books here.
Nice.
And Marissa will send them out.
Thank you
so much.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Congratulations.
Great seeing everybody.
Our residents are joining a happy hour to decompress, so you can meet the former residents. Alison, you're here. We didn't have much chance to hear from you, but there are other former residents joining us, so you can stay and then keep sharing experiences. Actually, there's a different link for that, so bye
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.
Great
See you
criticisms.
next time.
Okay, great work.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you.